Today we're going to talk about the fall of classical civilizations. They come to an end, right? It makes it nice and tidy when we talk about a classical period in history that has an end point. The College Board says that end point is 600 CE. That's an arbitrary year. We remember that, right? Because we're going to talk about the fall of Han China happening in the 3rd century, and we're going to talk about the fall of Rome happening in the 5th century. We'll talk about the fall of the Gupta happening in the 6th century, the fall of the Persians happening in the 7th century. You're not keeping up with what I'm saying right now. That's okay. That's okay. It's all in my notes. No worries there. But I'm trying to get you to understand that even though the College Board says that the classical period, this era 2, ends in the year 600, that is totally an arbitrary year that is picked by historians to make it easier to wrap our minds around this big period. All right? So even though the period ends around 600 CE, each of these classical civilizations, they're going to have their own fall, their own decline in their own time period. All right? But when it comes to the AP exam at the end of the year, you might be asked a question that has like a continuity and change over time question, for example. And the beginning or end of that time period is going to be like the year 600. So you should associate the year 600 with like the end of this classical period era 2 and the beginning of a post-classical period. And you should be able to associate all of the things that happen in the classical period with happening before 600. And then all of the things that happen after, happening after 600. So that's why we pick these, we call it historical periodization. I know you've heard that word before. We pick it to make it easier to organize things in your mind. You won't have to remember the specific years that each of these empires are going to fall. But please just understand that on the whole scheme of things, people aren't freaking out in the year 599 because the next year is going to be their end. All right? These are creations of historians that come far later to help all of us organize our thinking. When we talk about the fall of classical civilizations, this is a great place to talk about similarities and differences between them. All right? And the AP likes us to deal with, and history study likes us to deal with, how are different civilizations like each other? How are different civilizations different? We're going to see some commonalities between all of the falls, whether we're dealing with Rome or China or India or even the Persian Empire. We're going to talk about environmental damage that each of these empires are going to deal with, but we're going to focus there on Rome. We're going to talk about internal problems that each of these empires are going to deal with. When I say internal problems, I mean issues that are happening within the Han Dynasty that are challenging the central authority that's long been keeping everything together. And then we're going to talk about some external problems, problems from outside of the empire that are threatening the empire. So when we combine environmental issues with internal problems and note these are all going to be like interrelated, right? Like an internal problem is the environmental issue. Or when outsiders are trying to get into your empire and are causing you problems, guess what? There's going to be internal stresses caused from that. So these are all absolutely interrelated. Let's start with environmental damage, and we're going to look at Rome first. And here we have someone you are all very familiar with, but you probably didn't know he went back this far. All right? The Lorax, even his name kind of sounds Latin, right? And the Lorax is speaking for the trees because, man, did the Romans chop down a lot of trees. All right? And so the Roman Empire is going to be dealing with a problem of deforestation. And we're going to see this in other classical civilizations as well. Because wood is one of the most important commodities in all of human history. What are we using wood for in Rome? Now, time out, time out. You don't even know this. You've never read in your book what Romans are using wood for, right? But, and this is really important as we get to the AP exam and we start looking at some practice multiple choice questions, you're going to be asked a lot of questions that you don't know. And you're going to be really mad because you're raised in a world where the teacher is supposed to tell you everything. And you're going to come across questions and you're going to be like, Mr. Dobie never taught us that. But then you're going to start to recognize that you yourself are an intelligent person and you've lived a life on our planet. And we've already talked about how our existence today is not all that different from the existence of people 2 millennia ago, right? And you understand how wood can be useful to you. And the way wood can be useful to you is the exact same way that wood would be useful to people 2,000 years ago. So even though you've never read or never learned about how wood was useful to the Romans, how was wood useful to the Romans? Fire! What does fire do? It warms your homes, right? It cooks your food. Excellent. And as Rome is going to have a massively expanding population as it rises through its peak. Anybody know the name? We haven't really used this in class yet. The name for like the high period in Rome, where Rome was just dominant, where Rome was victorious in wars, where Rome was expanding, where Rome was experiencing population growth, where Rome was experiencing relative peace and harmony at home. Not the golden age. You could call it a golden age. But we use actually a Latin word because it's Roman. It's Latin for Roman peace. P. Say it out loud and proud. Pax Romana. Yeah, the Pax Romana. P-A-X. Romana is the Roman high time. And we're usually talking about the 1st and the 2nd century when we're talking about the high times in Rome. Pax Romana. P-A-X-R-O-M-A-N-A. The Roman peace. It's generally the peak of the Roman Empire. And as they're growing and as their population grows, they chop down more and more trees. They chop down trees to build with. They chop down trees to cook with. They chop down trees to warm their homes with in the wintertime. But then you also chop down trees for another reason. What's another reason we chop down trees?
Farming.
To have more land for farm. Very good. And I don't even mind your roads. No. Yeah, you would use Romeo Plank Road. Those of you that live on Romeo Plank, right, or live near Romeo Plank. Romeo Plank is called Romeo Plank because it used to literally be like a plank road, a road that had wood planks laid across it. So we use it for construction of roads. Very good. Excellent.
If you had a road made of wood, that would not last.
It's not going to be the best road. No. Roads out of stone are much longer lasting. And most Roman roads were made out of stone. But anyway, we understand that they're going to use this. And so they're going to chop down a bunch of forests. Chop down forests for the wood, for fuel and whatnot. Chop down forests to have more farming land. But what's a consequence of this deforestation, the chopping down of forests? Yes. What? Soil can get bad? Why? Erosion. Erosion. We're going to have erosion of soils. Because when there's a forest there, it holds the soil down. There's a lot of roots that are like, no, don't let the soil go anywhere. And when you chop that stuff down, when you clear cut that stuff away, and then you start farming that land, and because the Romans, they weren't, we are pretty much expert farmers right now, today. The Romans weren't expert farmers. They've got to learn a lot about farming over the next couple thousand years. So they would over-farm their land, and they would deplete the nutrients of the soil. And now there's no roots or anything to hold that soil in, and you get some heavy rains, whoosh, it's going to wash all that topsoil away, and now you can't grow anything. So we're going to get soil erosion. You're also going to get a lot of flooding. This is kind of counterintuitive, right? But because there's nothing to absorb that moisture, there's no roots to hold on to that moisture, there's nowhere for water to go but up. And so we'll experience Rome and other classical civilizations will experience, because of their environmental degradation, because of the deforestation, they'll experience actually more flooding. Flooding is problems like in urban areas when there's flooding, because you've got like the rise of sewers. There's sewers in Rome, and you're going to get the rise of those sewers, which means you're going to have a bunch of nasty things that are popping up in the population. And you might have spread of diseases and illnesses like that. Why would you have that? Because there's nowhere for it. When there's a flood, the sewers fill up, it rises, and some stuff floats up to the top. And you got sewer water in your community. That's not good.
Doesn't the sewer The way they design sewers, doesn't the sewer flow to a body of water, or is it?
Yeah, it'll eventually it works its way out to the sea, definitely. But there's a lot of duty right below you before it makes its way there, right? And as you get flooding, it's going to rise rapidly, and it can't escape fast enough, so it goes up and out. The same thing that happens today, right? You guys remember a year ago, right around this time, we had those wicked floods, and people left and right, their basements flooded in Michigan. Yeah, we had a lot of rain.
You get snow, you get floods, you get tornadoes.
Yeah. Or what South Carolina is dealing with right now.
I remember. Yeah.
Yep.
It's like literally streets on streets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
A couple of years ago, there was a big flood
Yeah.
going on, and my entire basement flooded,
Yeah, it's a bummer.
and it went through the drywall,
Yeah, that's no good.
and my dad had to rip everything out, and we got new carpet,
Yeah, it happens.
new walls. It was horrible.
It's a bummer, but it happens. And so Rome deals with this. But in the Roman Empire, they don't have as effective means to deal with flooding issues like this caused by their deforestation. So these environmental problems can start to cause stress on an empire, on a civilization. So we want to, when we think about falls of classical empires, we want to consider the environmental impact that we're making. Yes, ma'am?
Would Roman aqueducts, I think I'm saying that.
Yeah, aqueducts.
Would they do more good than bad? Because they're controlling water, so it helps with their farming, but it also detours water.
Yeah. I don't know that, because the aqueducts are usually coming from, highland waters, and then they just use gravity to make their way to city centers. I don't know if it's so dramatic as like eventual future damming projects and things like that that actually like divert rivers in different ways. I don't know the extent of that. Yeah.
This is kind of off topic, but there was another speculation that because the Romans really like to use iron.
Iron, yeah.
Iron, right?
Iron, yeah.
Silver. Okay, so you like to use iron to make a lot of things. You just like to make it.
Yeah.
You like to use iron to make cups,
Sure.
like a lot of like the stuff you eat with, like plates
Yeah.
and all that. So they speculated that since you're using iron all the time, and you're using like iron cups to drink and all that, like there could be poisoning in the iron.
Yeah, you know what? I've never heard of such a thing with regard to iron. Like I cook a lot on my iron skillet. It's one of my favorite things to cook with. But lead, I think might be what you're thinking. Yeah, lead being used has caused some people some issues. Let's press on a little bit. We're also going to discuss these internal problems that empires are dealing with. All of the classical empires, one highlight, like what makes the classical civilizations, is that they got far larger than any previous civilization. So whether we're talking about the Roman Empire, that will at its peak stretch all the way through Spain and today's France and southern England and North Africa, all the way around the Mediterranean. Got huge, right? China, the Han Dynasty, pushed further than the Qin Dynasty or any other Chinese empire before, or dynasty before that. Persia was a massive empire. Here, let's take a look at, here we have the Han Dynasty. The Persian Empire, massive. All of these are massive empires. And all of these classical empires are going to have a hard time maintaining the entire empire. Because you've got to have military outposts on your borders, on your frontier regions. Frontier just means like the edge of your empire, right? So you've got to have a lot of military, and that military costs money. And as you expand further, you need more military, so you have to raise more money. And how are we raising money? We're taxing people. And so you're pressing the population more for these tax dollars. As these empires grow, yes, sir, Tyler?
Is the Sassanid dynasty the one that Alexander the Great?
No, his was called the Seleucid Persian Empire. The Sassanids are later. They're going to be in. You're going to eventually fall by the 6th century. The Seleucids don't last that long in Persia. So as these empires grow greater, you're going to have to press the people for more tax dollars. You're going to have a harder time for your central bureaucrats, your government officials, to get word of government decrees to all corners of your empire. It starts to become more challenging. We're going to have, as these empires grow larger, As they have trade contacts with different civilizations, we already talked about like the Silk Road, for example. As they have trade contacts with different civilizations, we're going to see diseases, epidemic diseases on the rise. This is going to be an internal strain that nations have to deal with. When we talk specifically about individual empires, we can go to the Han Dynasty in China and talk about government bureaucratic corruption. When we start to have bureaucrats that aren't acting the way Confucius would want them to act, and maybe they are a little bit more concerned about their own well-being, maybe as the central authority starts to weaken, they don't pass all of the tax dollars on to the central government. So bureaucratic corruption, just corrupt government officials. Is this still something we deal with today? Yes. Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Does this cause decentralization?
Yeah, and this will begin a decentralization, the central government having less authority over this massive empire. And then we can imagine what happens next. You start to have less tax income, right? And then you might have to raise taxes even further on the people that are still paying taxes. And that frustrates them. That angers them. Now you have some social unrest in your community. And as you're bringing in less resources, you might have less to spend on your military that's protecting you around your empire, which makes it easier for what to happen? Invasions from outside. So all of this stuff is so tied together. China is going to experience some dramatic social unrest in the 2nd century. So this is the 100s of the Common Era, right? A revolt in China, a Taoist revolt. I thought the Taoists were the guys that just kind of let the world go by and didn't really stress themselves out much. Not always. In the 2nd century, China is going to deal with what's known as the Yellow Turban Revolt. Yes, sir?
Is this what starts the Three Kingdoms era?
And this is going to usher in, yes, usher in a breakdown of central authority of the Han Dynasty, yes. Yes, sir? The Yellow Turbans, Yellow Turban,
Like
the
I
Yellow
was going
Turban
off what
Revolt.
you said earlier about like Taoists being the stereotypical like peaceful guys. Well, when you have the population desperate with no food to eat, that's something's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. When people are comfortable, when people are fed, they're usually pretty calm. But as the government starts to do less of a strong job in organizing food production, for example, people start to get desperate. So China will deal with a Yellow Turban Revolt, which further weakens the central authority. And then epidemic diseases in China, because they've got so much contact with other peoples through their Silk Road trade. Epidemic diseases will almost cut the population of Han China in half. When you cut a population in half, what happens to your ability to bring in tax dollars? It plummets. And so then China will suffer from external invasions, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Yes, ma'am. Hannah in the back.
What's the reasons for the Yellow Turban Revolt?
General frustration, seeming persecution. Remember how we talked about Taoists and Confucianists not really seeing eye to eye with each other? Persecution of Taoists within China, and then a general uprising. Frustrated people rise up and protest. Government tries to squash it, they protest even harder. Tyler and then Alex.
I think the reason why the Yellow Turban actually started was this guy called Zhang Xiao. Where
Okay.
he was like a Taoist, but then he like used some kind of he convinced like the people in his area that he used sorcery and that God was speaking, the Taoist God was talking to him. So he gathered more, and then they under the banner of the yellow banner. That's why.
So kind of like a cultish kind of thing.
And then it kind of spread because everybody was hating the Han Dynasty at the time, and then like the warlords they call it, not
Yeah.
the warlords, but like the generals within the
Yeah.
Han Kingdom. They got together and they squashed the rebellion, but they actually squashed it. But then in that sense, the warlords became
more powerful.
and then they just split apart. And that's
Exactly.
the Three Kingdoms.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was gonna answer what she asked. So I'm very clear on this topic, and
Okay.
so because I talk about this a lot. So the reason, primarily the reason why they revolted was because at the time there was a natural reason. There was a drought.
A drought.
There
Okay.
was a large drought that pretty much wiped out a lot of farms, and at the same time the government is desperate because the emperor was not receiving as many taxes as he wanted to. So he was very suspicious of his bureaucrats, but the other The other reason he thought, because I'm not taxing these guys enough, so I need to get more taxes so we can get more money.
And it presses the population more and causes more frustration.
And it presses the population more, and even to make matters even worse, you have a drought that's going on. And so these guys have literally no food to eat, and so they're so desperate that the reason why the formal reason why they even started a revolt was saying, we need some money from the landlord that's right next to us, and the landlord has like huge cellar of like, you know, of crop.
So we've got the haves and the have-nots in classical China.
And yes, they did. Okay, so the primary result of this was, you remember how, like, from a religious standpoint, was that Taoism spread really rapidly after this? That is actually
Buddhism spread rapidly after this.
The guys who revolted were Taoists.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. So but in the chaos that's going to come out of this period of China, we're going to see a much larger rise in Buddhism in China. But continue. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, and so the emperor, obviously, if you're a central authority, you need to crush these guys because
they're a threat to you.
Yeah, they're a threat to your authority. And so at the time, the emperor was really lacking in, like for other reasons before this, he was really lacking in troops. So he had basically had a draft. Yeah. Like not a draft forcing civilians to join, but like just asking if anyone has their own army, come help me and I'll give you.
Mercenaries such as like Xiao or something, like warlords to go and squash the rebellion. But then in doing that, the warlords
boosted their authority.
Yeah, and they saw that the government was so weak just for a rebellion and not able to using their own troops to squash it. They thought, what if we just break out? We have our own.
This is awesome. And I would love these two gentlemen to teach a history of ancient China to you. Maybe fortunately for some of us, and unfortunately, the AP exam will never require this level of detail within classical China. What is the AP exam going to look for? Because it's all world history, all periods. The fall of the empires, overtaxation, internal threats, environmental issues, droughts and such. These are good topics. I'm going to press on really quickly. Gabby, you back? That's a Taoist revolt, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Smallpox, measles, some of the things we still deal with today. Bubonic plague, I think that's going to be a bigger issue in later times. I'm not sure of instances of actual plague at that point, but it's definitely going to come in later in history.
Explain why, for epidemics, like in all the classical empires, like even later on.
Yeah, because there's trade contacts between them. There's
not why, but why the diseases typically are, smallpox always being one of them, and even if you talk about like North America contact and later on in history.
Yeah, because it's nasty.
Because why is it that smallpox especially, but measles also, they seem to be by far the most common.
Yeah, because they're nasty diseases that spread easily through the air, and they get people really sick, and they can kill you. So, get your vaccines. All right, we press on. India, the fall of classical India. India's a little bit of a different story. Because we remember India was never as centralized as China was. So it shouldn't surprise us that the fall of classical India is not going to be as dramatic a fall as the fall of classical China. Because it never had the level of central bureaucracy that China would have. But there still is going to be a fall in India. Ultimately, by the 5th century of the Common Era, we start to have some weakening central control. Again, a rise in the power and authority of local princes and landlords. So the central authority has a harder time collecting taxes from all the local regions. And then when you have a harder time collecting those taxes, you're going to have a harder time paying your armies and funding your armies. So of course you'll have a harder time keeping outsiders out. Similar story here.
They lose control of the princes.
Yes.
And the princes basically turn to warlords.
Yeah, they're just small kings, small princes, and then the money stops going to the central government. And princes from over here, they don't care that these guys over here are having a hard time keeping outsiders out. because it's not them. So they're just more concerned with local protection.
So they stopped serving the central government?
Yeah, yeah. In Rome. Rome is maybe, at least for people in the United States, maybe the most famous fall. Rome is going to begin a gradual decline. You hear, or you'll read in your book, that the fall of Rome falls in the year 476 CE. But that makes it sound a little more dramatic than it is. All right? As in, everything was going fine in Rome, and then 476 comes and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. It wasn't like that. Rome goes through a few centuries of decline for all the same reasons that these other civilizations will. We get weaker leadership, weaker emperors that maybe aren't as dynamic or aren't as authoritative as previous leaders. Again, like China, suffering from plagues and population loss. There's a lot written about the Roman Empire becoming in the 3rd and in the 4th century a more decadent society. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before. The Roman citizens, especially in the city of Rome, stopped worrying too much about other things outside of them and started concentrating on their own personal satisfaction and enjoyment. Some people compared modern America with this era in Rome, where we became a little bit more selfish. We looked out for ourselves a little bit more. Population, birth rates will decline because I can attest, once you start having kids, you stop being able to do things that you want to do. And you have to do things that the family does or the kids want to do. Kids are expensive. Parents with children have to worry about paying for their kids' education. If you don't have children, you can go on cruises and fancy vacations. The Dobies, we don't get to go on as many fancy vacations or as extravagant vacation because we have to buy 4 airplane tickets, and that's expensive, right? But if it was just me, and well, it's hard to go to Hawaii by car. If it was just me and my wife, we could see the world, right? So the Roman Empire goes through this decadent period where Roman citizens had fewer children. And so they could enjoy their own lives a little bit more, which is all good for like the now. But it's not good for the sustaining of your civilization because we're going to see population declines. Not just from epidemic diseases killing people, but from people actively choosing to have fewer children. And there's a lot being written in today's society about Western Europe and Southern Europe, Italy, Russia, Japan, the modernized United States, starting to have less and less children. Less than 2 women or children per woman means your population is going to be in decline.
You need to have at least 3.
No, 2.1 does the trick. 2.1. Yeah, you got to have a little bit more because sometimes kids don't make it. Yeah. When I mentioned what? Yeah, decadent.
Okay, when you mentioned that, there was a part in the book where it was really confusing for me because it said that it was like Rome just like the culture just naturally decayed, emperors were getting lazy, they didn't want to do anything anymore. Is that what?
Yeah, like people kind of just worrying about their own business rather than the good of the whole. Yeah. All right. The Roman Empire fall. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, I was going to ask about the diseases again.
Yeah.
Because, I studied them back in science.
Awesome.
I'm not sure what, were these just small outbreaks or were they
No, we're talking about epidemic diseases that are causing massive problems for these, especially urban areas.
across all of Rome?
Not all of Rome at any one time, but especially the big city, like Rome itself. Alex.
I was reading 2 days before a few nights ago. So
Yeah.
I think I had some notes on this.
Okay.
So they said what the book said at least was that the aristocrats,
Yeah.
their aristocracy lost interest in cultural life, and it became a little more selfish, like
Yeah.
you said.
Yeah.
So the aristocrats stopped developing culture. And then the landlords gain more power and there's decentralization.
And it's the same story. So what we need to get out of this, and I apologize for pressing on, but I want to make sure we have enough time for you to do what you need to do. What we need to recognize is it's the same story across these civilizations. Persia. Don't want to leave out you Persians. Although we don't have too much to say. Again, massive expansion. It's a huge, massive, multi-ethnic empire that is Persia. And again, eventually the government starts pressing too much on its citizens and starting to overtax the people. So the people feel less connected to their central government. And the government has a harder time collecting those taxes. The Persians will also be dealing with the rise of other civilizations next to them. First, you guys can see here, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, that's going to be the new name historians are going to give the Roman Empire. When Rome falls, it's only the city of Rome that falls. And we recall earlier in Roman history, in the 4th century, we've got the capital of the Roman Empire that's moved to a new city, right? What city is that? Byzantium, which becomes known as Constantinople because of Emperor Constantine. Today it's Istanbul. So when Rome falls, it's just the fall of the city of Rome and the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continues, but it's going to continue by a different name. When the Persians ultimately fall, though, it's going to be in the 7th century when we have the rise of a Muslim empire, right next door to the Persians, that start putting pressure on Persia. And that brings us to our last conversation with regard to all of these, the external problems that all of these empires are going to deal with. As we have weakening central authority, as we have an overtaxed population, we have less ability of these central governments to police their borders, to maintain armies on the frontiers, these massive frontiers that they all have. So we're going to start seeing migrations of nomadic peoples. And it just, a coincidence of geography, that for all of these classical civilizations, they're going to be northern nomadic peoples. All right? That is just a coincidence of geography, because if we go back to Rome, we notice most of the northern nomadic peoples that could mess with Rome, because to the south of Rome is like the sea. The people that could mess with Rome are primarily to the north, right? The people that could mess with classical India are to the north because of the Indian Ocean. The people that could mess with Han China are to the north because of the South China Sea. The people that could mess with Persia tend to be to the north and to the east and the west because that's where they can come from. So we're going to talk about the northern nomadic migrant people, the tribal people, the people that had lived outside of these settled civilizations, causing threats. Yes, sir?
I think for China, the reason they don't have southern invasions is because they actually own something.
Yeah, exactly. They pushed all the way south already. So,
and it's always like, I saw this pattern over world history. It's like just southern parts of the world, like especially in the northern hemisphere, they tend to have weak. Well, they're not weak, but they just tend to have less. Like the less power, or there's like the empire is just dominated the south because southern parts of the world, especially because they're near the equator and have really good climates, so
not as conducive to this massive agriculture.
You'd be more like encouraged to push south than to push north.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mina.
Okay, really quick. When these empires kind of start falling, because all like trade is becoming such a big thing.
Yeah.
All of them,
Yeah.
when one of them falls,
Absolutely, absolutely. They're interdependent on each other. Or when one has some kind of disease epidemic, it's going to make it to other ones. Yeah, these guys are connected now, just like we are today. Maybe not to the same extent, but not completely different. So one group that we're going to kind of lump into a collective is a group of nomadic peoples from Central Asia. When I talk about Central Asia, we're talking about the lands to the north of China, the lands to the north of India. And Central Asia is a place where nomadic peoples, whether it be the Huns that we're going to talk about now, or the Mongols that we're going to talk about in a couple months, are regularly messing around with settled civilization. Because settled civilization has stuff that the nomads don't have. So they want to break in and they want to raid and they want to mess with them and take some of the stuff that they have. When empires are strong, they can keep them out. But when empires are experiencing all these internal problems that we've talked about, they'll have a hard time. One group that severely messes with the classical world are a group of people called the Huns. All right? The Huns are a Central Asian nomadic people. And there are a bunch of different groups of Huns. There are some Huns in the west that are going to be pushing into the Roman Empire. There are central Huns, or also called the White Huns, that you guys might have read about in Stearns, that push into the Gupta Empire. And then there's some debate as to whether these people are actually Huns or not, pushing into China, Xiongnu, the Xiongnu people, pushing into China. I believe Stearns refers to them as Huns invading into northern China. So if you see Huns, or if you use Huns or Xiongnu for China, you're absolutely fine. Outside nomadic invasions pushing on all of these empires, and the empires can't afford to hold them out anymore. So in the 3rd century, in the 200s, the Xiongnu push into the Han Dynasty. Amidst all the other chaos that's going on in the Han Empire, the Han Dynasty falls. By the late 4th century, we've got Huns pushing into Europe. You might have heard of a guy named Attila the Hun in the 5th century. You've heard of his name, good. You've got Huns pushing into Europe, and as those Huns push in, there's a bunch of Germanic people, like Ostrogoths and Vandals and Goths. You guys have heard the word Gothic. And the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons, who begin getting pushed by themselves. So as the Huns push in, the Goths begin to push deeper into Europe or even into the Roman Empire, causing more strain on the Roman borders. So the Huns are pushing the Goths push into Rome. This is a stress on the Roman Empire. You've got in the 6th century, in the 500s, northern Huns pushing into the Gupta Empire. And again, the Gupta Empire can't keep them out anymore.
Is this 6th century?
In the, 5th century, they push in. Ultimately, the Gupta fall in 550 CE. So all of these empires are experiencing the same thing. Internal problems, internal weaknesses, leading to external vulnerabilities. People from the outside able to get in. Questions?